Thank you, Jen, not only for bringing this wonderful group of women and men together, but for all of your work, for a lifetime of work. I salute you for that. I'd like to give you and of course for all of the other speakers, the other sisters and brothers in attendance. I have learned so much during these 2 days. I thank you all for that. Democracy. Once upon a time, the word evoked access, fairness, participatory representation. Once upon a time, we could think of the United States as a democracy, and defenders of its policies proposed it as an example to nations around the world. This hasn't been true for decades, of course, but the cartel, which less than 2 weeks ago succeeded in grabbing control of this country for the second time, has managed to radically change the meaning of the word. Today, the greatest democracy, in quotes, describes drastic curtailment of freedom and opportunity here at home and a politics of coercion, destruction, and death globally. But democracy isn't the only word or combination of words those criminals in high office have twisted beyond recognition. Others that come to mind just off the top of my head, and I'm sure you'll have plenty to add to this, are revolution, right to life, family values, sanctity of marriage, compassionate conservatism, healthcare, no child left behind, healthy economy, jobs for everyone, impartial journalism, weapons of mass destruction, freedom and liberty, count every vote and make every vote count. This discourse from an administration whose president boasts that he says what he means and means what he says is Orwellian doublespeak at its most outrageous. As someone who expresses herself primarily with words, I find misleading or cowardly turns of speech particularly annoying, often dangerous. In a true gift economy, speech that is truthful, courageous, filled with holistic vision, rich in linguistic beauty, and useful in that it offers choices and encourages positive change, is the most valuable currency there is. We used to think of lesbian as the L word. Now it's liberal. One in a long line of words co-opted. The neoconservative patriarchy currently exerting its power over our lives and over so many lives across the globe has paid special attention to language and its influence. Repeating the lie is referred to as staying on message. Soundbite shorthand replaces in-depth discussion. Spend enough money imbuing words and concepts with meanings different from, often diametrically opposed to, their original definitions, and people assimilate a language of lies. The unacceptable becomes acceptable. My generation of feminists paid indignant attention to how language was used. Early on, we demanded a discourse in which the pronouns he and his would no longer be common denominators, meant to represent all humankind. We invented the generic Ms. so that women wouldn't have to define ourselves by whether or not we belong to a man. We urged that language assume responsibility for its acts, not the passive, I was raped, but the more explicit, so-and-so raped me. Names, places, dates, accountability. A feminist and egalitarian use of language spread throughout the world. Women from different cultures and with different linguistic codes made innovative contributions to this reclamation of self. Speaking the truths of our lives helped us understand who we had been and might become. For years, I lived in Latin America, working for social change in Mexico, Cuba, and Nicaragua. There I learned that all the peoples of the continent call themselves Americans, a word long monopolized by the United States. In Mexico, que padre, in praise of the Father, is an exclamation denoting excitement or approval, while está de madre, quite literally, how mother-like, describes something ugly or wrong. Advertising for a popular beer displays la rubia de categoría, the high-class blonde. Prejudice reveals itself in speech in so many more ways than we are aware. Today, a fundamentalist reading of several different scriptures turns words and concepts inside out. We live in a time of redefinition and backlash. A powerful corporate media draws on unlimited financial resources and sophisticated psychological manipulation to make sure we all go along with the game plan. A punishing system of injustice makes sure we don't rebel. Fear and hatred of others is sold as keeping America safe. Policies advertised as repelling terrorism only increase the anger other nations and peoples feel when faced with US belligerence. Such policies do not keep us safe. They provoke for future attacks. Severe curtailment of citizen rights is described as a necessary sacrifice in the war on terror. Invasion is sold as liberation. An environmental policy that is poisoning the air we breathe, the water left for us to drink, and the earth that is our home bears names such as the Clean Air Act. How can we fight this rape of language? Even with a new and creative use of the internet, our resources are meager compared to those the system is able to muster against us. I believe in preserving and nurturing memory, in restoring language to its original meaning, and most of all, in the power of our stories. I have received so many precious stories in these 2 days, and I want to thank you again for those, not only given from this podium, but exchanged in the dining room and in restaurants and out there in the hall. And so I want to give you 2 stories. In the first, I call your attention to an underreported event that illustrates better than many the ways in which our government usurps and attempts to control our lives by usurping and controlling the authentic storylines of these times. The National Endowment for the Arts, a government agency established to support the art that sustains us, recently announced its latest project, launched in conjunction with the Pentagon and funded almost entirely by the Boeing Corporation. Military men and women recently returned from Afghanistan and Iraq will have the opportunity of attending workshops with professional writers. In these workshops, they will presumably learn the skills that will enable them to write about their experiences of war. The best of this writing will then be published in an anthology. one can only imagine the promotional efforts that will catapult the volume to bestseller status. Along with embedding journalists with contingents of fighting troops and the treatment of misinformation as entertainment, this project will help construct the official stories of the wars being fought today in our names. At first glance, this might seem to be a laudable endeavor. As in the case of the embedded journalists, won't these veterans be writing about what they've experienced on the ground? Isn't the protagonist always the most authentic storyteller? But look more closely. Rather than use public monies to send these veterans to legitimate writing programs where they may be able to gain some distance from their trauma, learn from mentors and peers, and eventually produce a literature tempered by time and self-reflection, the NEA's hurry-up approach takes men and women who are still living on military bases, still under military orders, and uses them to produce propaganda pretending to be art. Veterans of America's war in Vietnam who were able to write after years of struggle and healing have denounced this project as the worst sort of language control. The very men and women in a position to share the pain and horror of today's preemptive wars are being forced to regurgitate that pain and horror undigested, unexamined, and removed from context. It will take years for us to disentangle the real stories from this constructed storyline. The NEA project is one of many examples of how the Bush administration takes our language, twists it to serve its interests, and uses it against us in its assault upon our lives. The second story is my gift to all of you. It is a tender gift. I offer it here because it exemplifies the worst and the best of our humanity, the horrendous crimes, and the magnificent power of resistance that have defined our lives over the past half century. This is a true story. In Latin America during the 1970s, brutal dictatorships ravaged hundreds of thousands of lives in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, among many other countries. In those three countries, paramilitary forces captured young rebels, torturing and murdering them in clandestine prisons. Disappearance was a new type of state terrorism designed to punish revolutionaries and instill fear and uncertainty in their communities. These revolutionaries' small children were often stolen and given to childless couples involved with the criminal regimes. In many cases, pregnant women prisoners were kept alive only until their babies could be harvested, quite literally harvested. Then they were murdered, their offspring adopted by the very men and women against whom they had struggled. These are Latin America's lost children. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires is a tireless group of women with whom many of you are surely familiar. For years, they have demonstrated once a week for the return of their grandchildren. With determination, hope, and DNA technology, to date, some 60 lost children have been identified. Many wish to reconnect with their families of origin. Others, raised in a culture of hate, have been poisoned by an ideology that doesn't allow for them to reclaim the identities they never knew they had. This story I want to give you is the story of Sarah Mendes and her son, Simon. Sarah and her husband were Uruguayans captured in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on July 13, 1976. Like so many others, they were disappeared. Their 22-day-old son, Simon, was taken from his mother's arms and never seen again. But unlike most of the tens of thousands of disappeared, Sara and her comrade Mauricio Gatti survived years of torture and imprisonment. Unlike the majority of the disappeared, they did survive. In May 1981, Sara was freed. Like all such survivors, her process of re-entry and healing would be difficult. She made finding Simon her lifelong goal. The Sara Mendes Simon case became a popular cause in Uruguay. For years in Montevideo, lampposts and walls bore flyers asking, "¿Dónde está Simon? Where is Simon?" Sara was obsessed in her quest. Human rights organizations worked on this case along with hundreds of others. As months became years and years, decades, some began to refer to Sara as that crazy woman looking for a son who won't be found. Tenaciously, she appealed to governments and international institutions. Mostly they promised help, but did nothing. Several years ago, a Uruguayan senator named Rafael Michelini decided to take up Sara's quest. His father, and also Senator Zelmar Michelini, had been gunned down in the streets of Buenos Aires many years before by the same criminals who had taken Simon. Sara Mendes was his friend. He didn't think she was crazy. He did believe she had a right to find her son. Michelini asked himself what he might have done with a 22-day-old infant had he been a paramilitary operative in Buenos Aires all those years before. It occurred to him that he might have delivered the baby to the nearest police station. Based on this hypothesis, he located the precinct closest to the scene of the crime and set about to identify the men who had been on duty the night Simon was taken. 4 names surfaced, all belonging to officers now retired. The self-proclaimed detective decided to call these men one by one. As a member of parliament in neighboring Uruguay, he had some prestige. A brief introduction was enough to convince the first man on the list to meet him at a bar. As Michelini told the story of Sara and Simon, the man's eyes filled with tears. Recuerdo la noche como si fuera ayer. I remember the night as if it was yesterday, he said, and went on to describe the protocol they were ordered to follow when paramilitaries brought these children in. We did the necessary paperwork, and then we sent them to a nearby orphanage, he explained. It was clear that this man had been an honest policeman doing his job, not someone aligned with the dictatorship or who shared in the responsibility for its crimes. The retired policeman went on to describe how he had gone home and told his wife about the orphan child he had processed at the end of that night's shift. Childless themselves, she told him, "Ay viejo, son tan fríos esos lugares. Those orphanages are such cold places. Couldn't we adopt that baby ourselves?" And so it was that the policeman, now telling his story to Michelini, had gone and retrieved the child. He and his wife had raised him as their own. They had never told their son he was adopted, he said. "He's a good boy. We've had a happy life together." But Michelini could tell the story wouldn't end here. The retired policeman promised to go home, to talk to his son, and to leave it up to the boy, now 26, whether he wanted to meet his birth mother. He promised he'd be back in touch. A week later, Michelini got the call. Simone's adoptive father said the truth had come as a shock to his son. Upon learning of his origin, he'd left the house in confusion and gone to stay with his girlfriend. It was she who calmed him, the man said, and convinced him to find out more. He wanted to talk to Michelini, who assured him he would travel to Buenos Aires the following day. And this is why, on March 8th, 2002, as Sara Mendes emerged from a Montevideo radio station where she'd participated in an International Women's Day program and was making her way through the heavy traffic of Avenida Artigas, she heard her cell phone ring. Unaware of how her life was about to change, she reached into her bag, retrieved the phone, and said, "Hello." On the other end of the line, a young man's voice asked, "Mother?" The lamppost flyers in Montevideo now read, "Welcome home, Simone." This story and others like it from many different cultures and profiling the human experience in its broad array of tragedy and hope give us back our language, freed from the distorting manipulation that would use it against us. But this is not a story told in isolation. Obsessed as we are with our own recent election, we may have missed hearing about the election held a week earlier in Uruguay. In that small South American country, the stories of repression and struggle have been kept alive, passed from generation to generation. Few families do not have victims on one side or the other. Many of the torturers remain free. The dictatorship had been defeated when, in 1980, a plebiscite designed to perpetuate its power, that is, there was no way you could vote except yes, that was the only option on the ballot. In that election, 57.2% of voters spontaneously wrote the word no on their ballots. And this brought down the dictatorship. Slowly, steadily, people worked to revive an opposition movement. And that gives me hope for today. The Frente Amplio is made up of communists, socialists, Tupamaros, social democrats, environmentalists, and others. For 31 years, through a succession of elections, they gained in strength. Last month, on the 31st of October, with 51% of the vote, the Frente Amplio finally came to power. And in the same election, Uruguayans resisted a sinister measure to privatize water. Unlike the United States, the vote is obligatory in Uruguay, and there is no absentee ballot. And listen to this. Between 40 and 50,000 citizens who live in other countries came home just to participate in this national decision. People came across the Andes from Chile on bicycles. People came off airplanes at the airport in Montevideo wrapped in the national flag. People are still dancing in the streets. This shows what can happen where real issues are discussed, honest dialogue is encouraged, and language has not yet successfully been co-opted. Where people refuse to put up with doublespeak, Pharmaceutical companies are not allowed to advertise on television. Diet commercials do not follow on the heels of commercials featuring fast food. And grandparents and parents keep alive the stories that inform their lives. We cannot let the power greedy rip meaning from our words. We must not, we cannot let them usurp our stories. Memory and stories are among our most precious tools for life. We cannot allow them to be turned into weapons of death. Thank you.
It's been wonderful to see how people have used the gift of language in so many different ways, which is a gift in itself. And I also hope that that helps you to bear with me how I use this gift. And of course, it's shaped around a particular purpose and goal, but it is also shaped by my cultural roots and upbringing. When my almost 9-year-old grandson tried to read the title of my presentation, he stumbled over every single word. And I said, yes, it is a cumbersome title, but every single word in it is an important dimension of what I want to talk about. And the most important question that kind of motivated me to put those three pieces together is, what is all this effort for? Where are we going, and how are we getting there? In this presentation, I will be walking on Hope's Edge, which is the title of a book by Frances Moore Lappé and her daughter Anna Lappé. I first focus on what has been pushing our little planet closer to hope's very edge by looking at the way migrant domestic workers or trafficked women are being used, abused, or used up. In the second part of the presentation, I look at the radical political message that migrant domestic workers and trafficked women give to the world. They push our understanding of gift labor a bit further by laying bare its physical, bodily, place, and earthbound grounding, and how that must be the grounding for transnational global political connections. Their stories also tell us that we need to be both place-bound and nomadic. And they also tell us that we cannot disaggregate personal from social transformation. For the past 3 decades, my main political interests and concerns have been with international and sexual divisions of labor around the notion of subsistence work. Because raising children or mother work is primarily oriented towards sustaining life, it is a prime example of subsistence work. And as Genevieve has pointed out, it is also paradigmatic for gift labor. Moreover, and that is my emphasis here, it is place-bound work, and it is tied to the physical necessities, the blood, guts, and gore of real, messy life. I previously investigated how this place-bound work is inserted in a political economy of race-class segregation in the inner city of Chicago, where I live. Here, mothers do place-bound work in a confined, sectioned-off space. The welfare debate of the 90s, culminating in the 1996 Welfare Act in the US, did not criticize any racial economic segregations or confinements, nor did it criticize the relocation of jobs to cheap labor countries, jobs most inner-city residents held in the steel or car industry. It did, however, criticize by vilifying the place-bound nature of the work welfare mothers, also referred to as welfare queens, were doing. The government had to pay for work that made women get stuck in one place. They clearly had to become mobile, had to get away from their kids or disappear between the cracks of a punitive welfare system and of economic realities that offer jobs only to some and only for non-living wages. It is not difficult to see a link between this enforced mobility and the growing internationalization of domestic and cleaning work. In order for the state to reduce its expenses or to receive remittances badly needed to pay back loans to the IMF or World Bank, mothers have to be torn from their children. The children then become the invisible and never talked about little figures being pushed around in an abysmal or non-existing childcare system in the US, or being taken care of back home in the Netherlands of a private household. At the current stage in the patriarchal capitalist game, trafficking in women and the flow of migrant women, a term I read in many of the studies, across the globe are part and parcel of the overall transformation of national economies. Motherhood and sexuality are an integral, logical part of import-export schemes that are typical for this new economy, where poor countries export or send, and rich or richer countries import or receive. Mobile motherhood and mobile sex are intricately tied to capital mobility and to the extractive nature of a predatory finance capitalism. There are often tremendous cultural differences and geographical distances between so-called sending and receiving countries, and all countries have their own variations of patriarchal cultural practices. However, it is the patriarchal capitalist underbelly that provides the connective tissue of all paid or unpaid versions of a kind of labor that has always supported a capitalist interior infrastructure of service and servitude, one that has now simply gone global. It is only logical that the US military was the institution that introduced organized prostitution to the Philippines. Here, ordinary guns are joined by hard, erect penis guns. We can add to this arsenal of guns the gene gun, or what Genevieve Vaughn calls the phallic father money of the financial money gamblers. These guns are all pointed at real, organic, imperfect bodies or organisms. They blast DNA-coded particles into live, not yet modified organisms. They make bodies do what is profitable or pleasurable, penetrate them and dispose of them once they are no longer useful, or they simply bomb them out of existence. Global trafficking in women's bodies, or sex home delivery to American GIs, and rape of live-in maids to order in the privacy of individual households are all variations of the same greedy contempt for women's sexuality and birthing capacity. Real life is extracted from real bodies by trading them as disposable sex toys that get shipped back once American GIs infected them, or disposable domestic workers. Extraction is part and parcel of keeping in check such real life or real life capacity. Profitable capitalist patriarchal assaults on migrant women's bodies often result in death. For instance, as reported by Gabriela, a US-Philippine women's solidarity organization, 1 coffin per day is sent back to the Philippines with the body of a woman killed as a domestic or sex worker. Foreign domestics are aliens from a different culture, and they are non-citizens, which marks and regulates them as bonded or enslaved laborers. Or they are undocumented illegals desperate enough to put up with any kind of abuse. Pierre Tondanio Sotelo lists various agency names in the Los Angeles area which he studied: mamas made to order, domestic darlings, made in heaven, or custom made for you. She also observed that the name the maids themselves give to all of them is domestic desperation. In the United States, the workers' immigrant status provides the most powerful axis of inequality, especially with respect to live-in domestic workers. The informal privacy of individual, isolated households deliberately invites keeping desperate undocumented immigrants in slave-like conditions. Live-in jobs, the typical point of entry for Latina immigrants, are therefore described as prisons, where te encierra, you lock yourself up. Moreover, the Fair Labor Standards Act completely exempts live-in employees from overtime coverage. There exist some limited protective labor laws. Not surprisingly, those who, quote, work as personal attendants, for example, babysitters, caregivers to young children, or companions of the elderly or infirm, are explicitly excluded from the right to earn minimum wage and overtime pay. The laws cover those who clean and care for material possessions. If those who do private care work want to have the same legal rights, they must show that they devote at least 20% of their work time to housekeeping duties. In the US, the most powerful minority world country, the provisions of special visas allow foreign national diplomats and IMF and World Bank officials to import domestic help. B1 is a catch-all business category, and the State Department keeps no records of domestic helpers imported under its provisions. The workers suffer some of the most blatant abuses, from having to sleep outside with a family dog, being sexually harassed, or working for 16 hours per day all week long for $100 a month. The State Department does keep record of the whereabouts of A3 and G5 domestic workers, but this information is classified as confidential for the privacy of the employer. Not surprisingly, the women often live as prisoners in the homes they clean. All forms of hyperregulation, indentured servitude, or enslavement are interwoven with seemingly endless variations of racialization practices. Abetted by an equally diverse array of immigration policies, government-sponsored labor import of foreign contract labor programs, national regulatory regimes, and the action of placement or employment agencies, brothel owners, or sex traffickers. I condense a lot of information here, and I don't know that. Some labor importation or employment schemes hide the racialness of alien labor by camouflaging it with terms such as foreign, or by using the ability or inability to speak English as a code for national and ethnic stereotypical preferences. In other contexts, companies in the global sex business see absolutely no need to camouflage racialized attributes. In Germany or the Netherlands, for instance, brochures use racializations as advertisement turn-ons that praise slim, sunburned, and sweet wares because they love the white man in an erotic and devoted way, or because, as little slaves, they give real Thai warmth. The image that keeps popping up for me is one of stratus dwellers, the speculators in the stratosphere of casino capitalism, who get a kick out of looking down upon the entertaining dramas enacted by female employers and their female employees on the interior public stage of private isolated households. They may chuckle when an employer withholds the pay for her live-in maid in order to keep her from running away, where she gives her sub-minimum wage, but extends her working hours into the night, or where she subjects her to intimate scrutiny and control of her sexual life. Foreign domestic sex life is also severely monitored or controlled by various national regulatory regimes or allocation systems. A work permit may only be given if the imported domestic worker agrees not to marry a native-born man. She also has to, or at least pretend to be single. Or where she has children, these have to remain back home. The children of prostituted women workers in American military bases are treated as disposable as their mothers. As Ninochka Rochka from Gabriela told me, the children grow up in severe poverty and without education or any other social services. When I asked her what the women can do to protect themselves from becoming pregnant, she said they are discouraged from doing so because the Catholic Church does not allow any form of contraception. In other words, the power of money to force all life into prostitution or Christian pimping, as Claudia pointed out, that lies at the very core of the patriarchal capitalist economy means controlling the use of a woman's sexuality, and it easily blends in with the religious act of taking away women's agency as regards their birthing power. The patriarchal stratus dwellers have been busily at work in their urge to find ways of bringing life processes under total control, of purifying the impurity of sexuality in birthing, or as Claudia said, of following their dream of a birthing machine that does away altogether with the need for impure, dirty mother bodies. DNA has now obtained the alchemical status of coding and therefore creating quintessential pure life. It can be extracted from real, that is impure life, and it can be shelved in a DNA library where bacterial colonies provide identical copies of an original DNA fragment. DNA-coded particles can then be blasted into cells via microprojectiles, the ballistic method, or propelled via electrical discharge into plant material, the Excel method. While there are other, less violent methods, the fact that the gene gun is a commonplace name and tool in the field of transgenic modification is almost reassuringly non-surprising. It is also not surprising that in the US we hear only of the successes of fast-growing chicken or pesticide-resistant corn, but not of the failures associated with the unpredictability of the impure, messy part of live plants or animals. How many people in the US know that entire transgenic crops fail to grow the way they were modified to do, thus driving thousands of indebted farmers to suicide? Who has heard about hundreds of failed animal cloning experiments where the animals suffered from arthritis, gastric ulcer, diabetes, or where salmon delivered deformed heads, jaws, and gill flaps? It's now time to look at the other side of hope's edge. Instead of joining the stratus dwellers by speculating on the utopian possibilities of a cyber technology they created, I rather look at the fate of millions of people all over the globe. Most of humankind neither surfs the net nor has access to the disembodied experiences of a virtual reality. Women's reality of being cut or penetrated is not a simulated version of cybersex, nor is it that of women who have their breast size reduced or enlarged. Both groups are at opposite ends of the patriarchal pole that nevertheless unites them. Both groups live the patriarchal script. How can we then move, I ask, from a global culture that glorifies virtual technobodies in corporate cyberspace and extracts the life out of real flesh and blood bodies who keep moving from place to place and who are picking up after the lords of cyberspace, the stratus dwellers, and after their children? How can we stay grounded in our physical, bodily, place-bound reality and reach across vast geographical and cultural distances? Where is our anchor? As an alien resident in the United States, I have been studying various writings on diaspora living. Home is a recurrent motif in these writings. Some writers focus primarily on the big home and describe the anguish of national relocations or displacements, of living in exile or in a diaspora, of transnational migrations. There are, of course, also analyses of the little home. They address the presumably mundane tasks and experiences associated with daily living in a small place and space. We all know that experiences in the little home are fully embedded in problematic normative assumptions and larger social power relations. Other writers, such as bell hooks, for instance, emphasize how a physical home place provides safety, especially in a hostile social environment, and how doing home therefore includes work that benefits the well-being of an entire community. And with Maria talked about it. The collection of essays in this bridge we call home is exemplary for revealing the many hidden social, cultural, and political connections between the big home and the little home. I believe that replacing domestic with home can ignite a flare of radical political sparks. The very word domestic conjures up images of narrowness, smallness, docility, or violently enforced captivity. On the other hand, home can link the smallness of a concrete place with the largeness of wide open space. Gloria Anzaldúa writes that home is that bridge, the in-between place of Nepantla in constant transition, the most unsafe of all spaces. She refers to the struggles of a traveler in transition to a new way of seeing herself and herself in relation to others and to the world. Migrant domestic workers' experience speak more directly and more brutally of home, not only as the most unsafe of all spaces, but also of all places. Yet, these workers are also messengers of an embodied, grounded Nepantla. They are walking hope's edge. Many Filipino migrant workers, for instance, have shown that it is possible to develop transnational bonds or transnational family ties. In other words, they show us possibilities of transnational homemaking. At the same time, the work of migrant nannies, housekeepers also shows us that hope isn't clear or tidy, that it has an edge, that it is messy, as it is woven into place-bound care work. Walking on hope's razor-sharp edge therefore means being able to form transnational bonds and simultaneously being able to form strong emotional bonds with a foreign employer's children, and this despite the fact that one's own children are far away and one can see them only once in a blue moon. This is the message for global feminism. We can or should be place-bound as well as moving, anchored in the bodies and the land's multiple needs and gift offerings, but also transmigratory or nomadic. In other words, we can be at home both in our own place and space and in the world at large by constructing a nomadic home. Such a transitional home place links the recognition and affirmation of a concrete, solid place to the recognition and affirmation of many other concrete, solid places in different social, cultural, and political spaces that together build the foundations of our world. I have only a few more minutes, so bear with me. Sex workers, maids, and nannies have to navigate between many kinds of externally, violently imposed norms and expectations regarding servicing employers' or clients' needs and desires. However, both care and sex work are inseparable from primary bodily events, that is, birth and sexuality. At the same time, there are fundamental differences between cleaning a house, serving male sexual desires, and taking care of children's well-being, whether corresponding norms and expectations are self-imposed or externally forced upon the actors. Caring for children is of a different order than cleaning a house, and whereas sexuality can be experienced as a powerful life force that may or may not be linked to the creation of new life, celebrating that life force is nevertheless fundamentally different from the actual physical giving of life. Likewise, assuming responsibility for one's own sexual or sexual partner's well-being is also quite different from assuming responsibility for the care of new life. Once born, a child reminds us daily and nightly of the bodily, messy grounding of life, of being alive. Care work is not simply about reproducing humankind. It is about sustaining life by making and letting it grow in a way that affirms its physical, material, bodily grounding. If we want to be not only critical of neoliberalism and neo-patriarchy, but also eager to advance new ways of understanding, we must foreground the existence and needs of children, both in our theory and our practice. Regardless of where they live and under what circumstances, children's need for care is universal. How we greet, carry out, and ultimately transform this universal need into work that sustains life in general is a question that points to larger, all-embracing responsibilities. The African American migrant women in the United States East Bay community made that point quite clear by considering children as the freshest link in the web of reciprocal obligations. It is this universal collective and reciprocal obligation that provides the concrete, physical, spiritual foundation for making connections between people and places that may be separated by vast geographical, geopolitical, and cultural distances. These connections can be expanded, translated into reciprocal obligations to safeguard, repair, or rebuild the conditions of life that is our future. In this conference, some of you are specifically addressing one of our body's vital dimensions I can here only hint at. The body is an entity that is intricately intertwined with the earth, the land upon which it walks or rests, and from which it draws its nourishment. Gloria Anzaldúa declares the body to be the royal road to consciousness, and that the body, quote, is rooted in the earth, la tierra itself. You meet ensoulment in trees, in woods, in streams. The roots del árbol de la vida of all planetary beings are nature, soul, body. Planetary homemaking means caring for the foundations of life, for the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land on which we grow our food. Safeguarding biodiversity and the integrity of individual life forms are therefore integral components of making the world a home for all. Planetary homemaking means creating a life-affirming big home that is attentive to the universal yearning for being grounded, for being safe, for belonging, and for finding shelter, rest, and physical, spiritual nourishment. I think the metaphor of a topographical map is particularly useful here, especially with respect to its central aspect, the contour lines. Contour lines is a quote, a lines of constant elevation connecting places at precisely the same altitude to reveal a terrain's three-dimensional shape. Cindy Katz suggests that we use this metaphor as a tool for imagining a politics that maintains the distinctness of a place while recognizing that it is connected analytically to other places, and that this, along contour lines that represent not elevation, but particular relations to a process. In her case, she talks about the globalizing capitalist relations of production. But the map metaphor not only allows us to make critical analytical connections between people's unique relations to capitalist forces of production, or more precisely, of extraction. It also lets us mark the places where we are located, where we are at home, collectively and individually, in our bodies, on the land, the earth, the world. This means that we can also find deeply felt connections, but only if we reach a certain place within ourselves. Anzaldúa's complex and elaborate story of how we can move through the 7 stages of conocimiento if we want to develop different relations to self, others, and the world tell us of the inner work we have to do by walking on hope's thin and razor-sharp edge. Although we are all starting such a journey from very different places and spaces, the points, I have 1 more minute, okay. Anzaldúa addresses may be helpful guides for this inner work. The journey starts from what appears safe or familiar to us, moves us into the transitional in-between space of Nepantla and onto despair and self-loathing when we begin to see our thought traps, our emotional intellectual presence we all experience. But these moments are also beginnings of a spiritual conversion where we critically rearrange the patches of our reality. When we move on to testing this new reality out in the world, different realities are bound to clash. The disappointment with ourselves and others can also become the critical turning points of transformation where we shift realities, develop an ethical, compassionate strategy with which to negotiate conflicts and difference within self and between others. This journey, this walking on hope's edge, gives us a glimpse into the terrifying, challenging, but also inspiring tasks that are still and continue to remain ahead of us, no matter whether and how often we have already been moving through various stages of conocimiento and nomadic becoming. It makes us see points of elevation or contour lines of counter-topographies where our walk on hope's edge means making analytical and deeply felt connections across cultures, languages, and places of origin.
And many thanks to our great speakers who have spoken before us. Many thanks to Jen for supporting the work of the Rural Women's Movement of KwaZulu-Natal, where I'm coming from. The Rural Women's Movement is working with indigenous, poor, rural, landless women from communities who were forcibly removed from their land way back in 1913. It is made up of more than 500 community-based women's organizations with a total membership of about 15,000 women. Their ages range between 16 and 78 years of age. Faced by legacy of apartheid systems, the province of KwaZulu-Natal is characterized by a deep rural consciousness and social conservatism evidenced in strongly traditionally social values, including around gender roles and relationships. For the most part of women are located firmly within patriarchal households. That was very evident when we interviewed one of the chairperson of the Community Land Trust in one of the districts, where he said to us, "I'm the manager of my household. I have knowledge about a number of things. Therefore, I don't want my wife getting involved because she might fumble and mess things up. A woman will do things in a female way and mix things up. She may even sell our land to her boyfriends, but the man will be held responsible should there be a problem in the community. When the police come, they ask for the man. So women should follow their husbands." That was very sad on our part, because when the government started the land reform program in 1995, the government made it very clear that all land reform projects, women must be represented and their voice must be heard. But this chairperson, who was supposed to be assisting the project in his community, was against having women in decision-making structures. The social and agrarian history of some districts in the province is marked by conflict and extreme social divisions, in which land conflicts have played an important part. The deeply scarred patterns of contestation over land, territorial boundaries, and labor stretch back to mid-19th century. They involved not only conflict between black landless or land-hungry communities and white landowners, but also clan-based violence within black communities. In one magisterial district where labor tenancy was abolished, more than 20,000 people were forcibly evicted off the white-owned farms between 1969 and 1972. Many of them were dumped in rudimentary resettlement camps, close to their former land. The province where I'm coming from is one of the poorest provinces with more than 70% people living in rural areas, and our rural areas are significantly worse off compared to urban areas. It is estimated that more than 30% of households are headed by women, and women-headed households are worse off compared to households headed by men in terms of poverty. A convenient starting point would be for me to consider in this paper where, as African rural community, are coming from in terms of gender relations, women, land, and property rights. As the movement, we are advocating for women's independent land and property rights. Pre-colonialism, individuals could not own land. Land was regarded as a sacred gift from Umvelingangi and ancestral land. When a child was about to be born, the grandmothers, as a symbol of which was symbolizing that if a person comes to this land, Mother Earth is the first person to take care of the newly born baby. The grandmothers would go, while the mother is in labor, they will quickly go outside and dig enough soil to make like a little bed in a hut, put blankets on the soil, and let the woman who is in labor lie on that soil. That soil was kept in the hut for 2 weeks. It was only removed after the child was 2 weeks old. Mother Earth was also regarded as someone who is a home for our ancestral, for our people who had passed on, and was regarded as somebody who feeds the nation through the nation's agricultural activities. Food was produced by individual families, but was not individualized. Communities in that area, when having supper at night, women will come with a bowl of food, and they will all gather in a great grandmother's house. And everybody, children, women, and men, will all sit in a circle, and each mother will come with a bowl, and they will all eat from these bowls of different food. In that way, there were no people who were suffering from starvation, because even if a family did not have enough food to cook, to take to the great-grandmother's house for supper, they will just go without taking anything with them and eat with the rest of the extended family. And it was not only the extended family, it was also the neighbors. I only discovered this year that the uncle that my mother is always talking about was in fact not my grandfather's brother. They were neighbors, and they were so close in such a way that even the children regarded, even my mother and her sisters regarded this neighbor as their uncle. I only discovered this year that that uncle was not actually from my grandfather's family. The way communities were staying together and sharing whatever they had. And land was not owned by individuals. People were plowing the land as the community, and the food that was produced from the land was for everybody, even the children. If a woman wants maybe to go for a couple of days, she didn't even have to go to someone and say, please look after my children while I am away. She would just tell the neighbors that she is going away, and the children would go to any house and will find the food. And the great-grandmother's house, it was a requisite that there must be food in that house, because there were people who were walking long distances, who were strangers, and if they go past the community, they will knock on the door, and there was always have to be food ready for anybody who could come anytime. Even the children, when they come back from the field, maybe looking after the cattle, they didn't have to go to their mother's house in order to get food. They would go into any house and find food. Mother Earth was regarded as a sacred gift from Umvelingangi, and no one could own her as an individual. Even property was not owned as an individual property. The household heads, who were usually men, were regarded as managers, and they would not take any decision without consulting their extended family, including the children. Even the children had a voice in how the cattle could be used. And their voice was respected by the elders. Women had access to property, and they were treated with respect. In order for communities to build houses, we were performing what we used to call ilima, where the community will come together in support of a community member who wants to be assisted, maybe to carry out bigger tasks like plowing the land or building a house. The assisting member will be served with drinks and food, and the assisted member will participate in the next ilima. And amalima were happening like in every week, because this week we're building so and so's house, and next week we'll be building another person's house. And that practice still exists in some communities in our rural areas. We still, the principles still exist in events like weddings, burials, and credit unions. Colonialism left women without access to land. It took away all that togetherness. People became individuals, and land became individualized, and it was carved into small pieces, and 87% of it was given to the hands of the few white men, and the majority of the nation was only left with 13% of barren land to survive on. And for in the efforts of the colonizers to push our men into migration, they started saying people cannot have an X number of cattle. It was illegal. People had to reduce their cattle. And the cattle and tilling of the land was the only means of survival for our communities. The migration came with breakdown of community structures and also breakdown of family values. And as African, we began to look at our households as individual households. It is when we started to see children who are orphans. It is when we started to see children, street children. In 1991, it was estimated that we had 100,000 street children. I don't have the statistics right now. And before the land was taken away from the communities did not need to have money. People could survive without money. My mom is telling me that my grandfather was taking turns to work for money with his brothers. They will negotiate who is going to go and work for money this year, because the others were working at home on the land, and the others were taking care of the cattle. And the money that was earned by that person who had volunteered to go and work for money was not his own money, because the others were at home looking after his cattle, after his family, and plowing the fields. So that money that he brought back home was for the whole extended family. It was not individualized. All of that has gone because of a scarcity of resources and scarcity of land. The breakdown of extended families is seen as the main cause of poverty, which is facing especially women and children in the rural areas. Women and children are representing a population of about 60% who are living under poverty line in the rural areas. As a nation, we are witnessing big evictions of women who are evicted from their marital homes and from their bed homes after the death of their fathers and mother. After the death of their fathers, and also after the death of their husband. The movement's main strategy is to get South African youth, most particularly the youth between the 11 to 19 years old, talking more openly about sex and sexual transmitted diseases and the impact of HIV and AIDS. We strongly believe that this strategy will work because there is substantial evidence from the different countries that HIV prevention programs work. But to be successful, prevention programs must be strategically targeted and sustained over many years in order to bring about lasting transformation. Our dream about this program was motivated by increasing evidence that the HIV and AIDS epidemic especially in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, where I come from, would affect labor in agriculture, increase malnutrition, add to the problems of rural women, especially female-headed households, arising from gender, division of labor and land rights and resources, and deepen the debt crisis by increased amount of medical expenses for sick members of families and increased number of funerals. It is estimated that as the nation, we lose 600 loved ones every month from AIDS-related diseases like TB and pneumonia. It's also estimated that every day there are 1,500 to 1,800 new infections. It's also worth noting that it is acknowledged in South Africa that land organizations have not, until recently, needed to take account of issues such as HIV and AIDS because of what has been perceived as more pressing issues. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that HIV and AIDS is likely to present one of the greatest challenges to land reform, agricultural production, and capacity building of communities. I touched on the breakdown of family values and what communities see as a result of that is the high rate of teenage pregnancy. More than 1/3 of births in South Africa are to girls under the age of 18. This is one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates in the world. STDs such as syphilis are commonplace among sexually active teenagers. And despite some public education efforts over the past 10 years, condom usage among teenagers remain around 10 and 15%. But there are many interrelated factors contributing to an environment of increasing sexual promiscuity. Abuse and violence among young South Africans, poverty, disintegration of family structures, political liberation, and dysfunctioning schooling are among the main causes shaping the attitude of our young youth, young South Africans. The discussions we have had with the youth show, however, that young people most lack and most want direction from parents and older people. The Minister of Health is predicting that by 2005, about 6 million South Africans will be infected with HIV, of whom 1.5 million are orphan children. Unfortunately, the prevalence rate of HIV in KwaZulu-Natal is considerably higher than the national average. For example, 37.5% of participants in antenatal care clinics are infected. It's evident that more women than men are infected. Reasons of why it's like that, some of them are quite clear. Infections among South African women has increased dramatically, especially among women aged between 20 and 39, and among the poor African women. Women who are poor are doubly vulnerable because they have no economic or social power. In a situation where gender inequality is culturally entrenched, this is frequently associated with violence and abuse, and this is further advancing the spread of HIV. It is worth noting that one of the workshops we have had more than 50% of the HIV positive colleagues of ours who participated are married and faithful to one partner of their lives. Even those in abusive situations remain in them for financial support, especially for their children. AIDS is also putting more pressure on women as we have to make hard choices in allocating time between household need, childcare, and care of the sick. AIDS poses challenging questions to existing approaches for development, which is part of the reasons why, as a land rights organization, we decided to integrate gender into our work. We see gender as a cross-cutting issue that needs to be integrated into all our rural development projects. In some situations, the epidemic has exposed the failure of previous development interventions to address persisting gender inequalities. In many cases, existing inequalities have been exacerbated by the epidemic. For example, women widowed by AIDS have become increasingly disempowered in terms of access to land. Not one of us is untouched by the rising incidence of sickness and death rapidly engulfing our nation. Not only does this reduce our productivity when we lose valuable team members, but we also find we are ourselves often depressed. We are carrying a heavy burden of grief. Our work has shown that the impact of HIV has also raised the importance of intra-household entitlements to food and other resources, partly due to the use in the number of orphan children being taken in by different families. Gender-sensitive and entitlement-based approach are now more urgent than ever before. I would like, with the permission of our chairperson, Jen, I would like to share a very short story of the 4 children who lost their mother a couple of weeks ago. This woman was dying of HIV and AIDS after all her family members, including the grandmother and the grandfather of her children. She was the last one to die in the family, and I think because she was the last person to die in the family, she kind of resisted. She didn't want to die. In order for one to come into her room, one had to have a broom because there were worms crawling around in her room, and her bed was dripping with body fluids. Her body was finished, and 4 children, the youngest is a 4-year little girl, had to witness that situation. She refused to die until she said to the women who were looking after her, "Oh, I have remembered. I can still die, and my children would not suffer that much. I can remember that someone from somewhere would come and take care of my children." And she asked 4 women if they could please look after her 4 children. And they said they'd be happy to assist her. A week later, she passed on, and these 4 women came to collect the children and took them to their homes. Within a week's time, the children had ran away from those homes and came back home. When the community members noticed that the children were back home, it looked like it was like 2 days after they have run away from the areas where they are staying with these foster parents. And one of our colleagues, who is one of our community health workers, called me on the phone to say that there are children who are on their own in their home, and it looks like they haven't eaten for a couple of days, and the community do not have anything to share with the children, because in our country, it's estimated that 43% of the productive, active population is unemployed. And as activists, we are saying 43% is not showing, is not reflecting what we are seeing in the rural areas. Because in the rural areas, we are seeing people who haven't been employed for the last decade. And when the government talks about the 43%, they are talking about the people who are still looking for jobs. And those statistics do not include those people who have given up looking for jobs. The community health worker who called me on the phone did not even have food for her own children. And because we had a bit of money in our account, I quickly phoned our chairperson and asked her if we could please take some of the money and buy some food for the children. And that was not the part of the reason why that money was raised. We were doing what we were not supposed to do, because that money was raised to buy uniform and food, no, not food, school uniform, and pay for the school fees for the children. So the situation is quite scary, and it doesn't look like it's gonna come right very soon, especially in the rural areas. Thank you very much.
I offer you this afternoon a few stories of audacity. I think if we want to feel hopeful about what we can do for the world and for women and through women, we might look back. We have only to look at one moment in history toward the end of the 20th century, as well as the beautiful things we have seen from Vicki and others today. But let's take a moment to see the advances made, at least in the United States, briefly, during the 1970s. If someone had told me how much progress we might make simply by advancing women's knowledge, education, and giving them a broader perspective about what needed to happen for the world, and giving them certain tools, financial education, philanthropic education, and some analysis, certainly, of their place of privilege in the world, I would have said, you must be dreaming. Being your speaker after hearing the stories of what is going on in South Africa and many other places, I recognize my place of privilege. But I want to share with you, as part of the spectrum of the offerings today, that which has been my journey. And we'll go through a few things to share that story. For the past 31 years, I've worked full-time as a feminist donor organizer within the context of the social change and women's funding movements. As a young inheritor in 1973, I graduated from a privileged institution, Sarah Lawrence College, with a degree in mythology. This is a study of cultures and of spirit across those cultures. I was a seeker for justice and the promise of democracy during the 1960s tragedies and multiple slayings of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and many others. I was ignited by these incidents and fueled by the injustices I had witnessed for African Americans in the civil rights movement, as well as in the halls of my own family's residences. I knew nothing about what was going on globally. Raised mostly by African American caregivers and household workers, I knew what community and family could be. I was determined to change the economic injustice which I knew existed when I heard what weekly pay these beloved family members for me received relative to my golf-playing and charitable parents who were part of the conspicuous wealth movement in the 1960s and 1970s. At age 9, I discovered that most of those who cared for me were being paid $75 a week or $350 a month plus room and board, relative to the $10,000 a month in checks or stock that my parents received via inheritance or simply as wealth holders. This was a gap in a household partnership that I could not tolerate and have worked to change ever since. Nellie, my primary caregiver to her death after 55 years of service to my family, simply said, "Tracy, just love people, and they will heal over time, and so will you." Nellie embodied the gift economy and will always be my first role model for giving and sharing. But Nellie also exposed me to the realities of my class and race privilege and its responsibilities, and was diligent in her way as a woman with a third-grade education about being sure that I knew that I would have opportunities with wealth ahead. She said I should think carefully about how to use any influence as a white inheritor that I would have, and expose me to people and communities outside the elitism and the illusion of my own class upbringing. I was truly blessed. I was propelled toward a vision of a just society and fueled by the social and very personal injustices for people I loved that I had witnessed. Nothing has taken me off that track since. I had moved from New York and the various places that my family had their 5 homes to San Francisco, and was so glad to find a diverse and political community that was ripe for growth. In 1973, when I arrived, it was burgeoning in its need for women-led projects and institutions. As the product mostly of women-only schools, I knew well the benefit of women's voices and fell quickly into both my own preference for working with and loving women. My feminism was sparked during my own job search in my early 20s and bolstered by the growing visibility of more and more women leaders and artists making their voices heard and perspectives clear. I can remember thinking that I had found heaven when in 1977 I attended a Women on Wheels concert with women musicians donating their time to help prison reform for women prisoners. Given the interplay between the artists, the passion of the music and the poets in the room, the hope that was uncorked, and the mission to build a just society, I had found my tribe. I was sure I had fallen into heaven prematurely. It was a time of utopian partnerships. I loved and valued women and had total freedom to do so. How unusual this is and was. For 25 years, I worked and lived in the idealism of the Bay Area, starting with a team of others, women all, the Women's Building, women's music, funding cultural projects, local and global women's foundations, battered women's shelters, women's health clinics, children's empowerment programs, women's leadership efforts, women and people of color projects, and countless projects that have protected the civil rights of women and the disenfranchised. All in all, I've participated in the emergence of some 400 new projects or organizations led by women, 90% of which stand across the United States and elsewhere. And I have heard annually about at least 500 new projects for over 30 years. This is more than 15,000 projects that women have birthed, at least in ideas for creating change. And you have heard of millions more. I bring you optimism. At the age of 35 in 1986, after going on over 350 site visits to explore the viability or health of various projects, or just to learn about the creative capital, the courage capital, and the wisdom capital of the leaders in those organizations, I was inspired to give away the full inheritance, $1 million that I had received, and to build a movement of more engaged donors who would fund similar projects and leaders who were building feminist or social change organizations. I had a change strategy. I had a theory of change. But it had taken me 10 or 12 years to figure out what that was. It was very clear. We needed more donors and effective leaders who saw social change philanthropy and socially responsible investing as key leverage points in building a world that would work for more people, and who will redistribute their wealth and power and be active partners in that new and more civil society. We needed to dismantle patriarchy, and we needed to dismantle capitalism. I had no idea how. I'm still with you on that agenda. We needed more women and women leaders who understand how to use their money and their influence, and who could articulate a vision for a more just society and influence people to get there. Clearly, women would be the ones to shape and leverage the changes ahead. We look to the women's spirituality movement for our history, for the images provided so wonderfully by so many of you, to give us the courage to go forward. We deepened our spiritual practice to tool ourselves. As I traveled in the service of that mission, I was soon to see how many people wanted, in fact, to make a difference, and who were eager or already on path with at least part of this mission. Little did I know that millions of women were moving simultaneously globally to bolster and propel more change. They are with us now. We knew in the 1970s that we needed culture, and we needed hundreds of women's recordings, theater, publishing, bookstores, radio programs, community centers, and cafes to assure that we could find each other. We knew we needed a magazine, or a way to communicate with each other on a more regular basis. The Ms. magazine was one place to exchange ideas, and when it failed us in being too mainstream, we were sure to publish more radical dialogue or to tune into our favorite public radio stations and hear the voices of, recorded by Frida Worden, Dorothy Abbott, Maria Suarez, and others who have diligently documented our movement over the years. Worldwide, women's voices were coming forth. We had won Roe versus Wade in 1973. We were on a roll to advance the new generation of women who wanted to work or who needed to work in better paying jobs, and we knew we needed policy changes. We needed women lawyers, doctors, politicians, and we made sure that they had opportunities. We looked globally at the 1977 Houston International Year of Women. We created a platform. We rolled up our sleeves to join our global sisters. The women's movement felt unstoppable. Jill Ruckelshaus said in 1977, "We are in for a very, very long haul. I'm asking for everything you have to give. We will never give up. You will lose your youth, your sleep, your patience, your sense of humor, and occasionally the understanding and support of people that you love very, very much. In return, I have nothing to offer you but your pride in being a woman and all your dreams you've ever had for your daughters and nieces and granddaughters, your future, and the certain knowledge that at the end of your days you will be able to look back and say, once in your life you gave everything you had for justice, everything." This was for me, and still is for many of us, a kind of inner refrain that flowed in me like the wave of feminists around me, moving women towards our full potential. The angels speak here. We knew we needed money for all our efforts, and that building women's funds or foundations was the surest way for women and girls to learn and control local and global financial resources. Albeit that many of these funds had only hundreds of thousands of dollars, we knew over time that they would have multi-millions, and we wanted women to collect, to learn how to fundraise, and to redirect these dollars powerfully. We knew we had to change the body politic to make systems change as well. Funding locally or funding globally women and women's leadership seemed an obvious place to start. We grew between 1973 and 1985 some 50 new women's foundations, and there are now over 125, 100 in the United States and 25 emerging internationally. We will have by 2020, I predict, a total of 50 women's funds globally. The Global Fund for Women began in 1983 and is now recognized as the premier of these women's funds and has managed to redistribute some $25 million from over 10,000 donors to 181 countries worldwide in only 20 years. Women donors began to convene under the Women Donors Network in 1990 through my organizing, and at the first meeting there was $2 billion present in the assets in which these 25 women donors present were stewarding. These 25 donors were giving collectively, though not funding it all together, some $150 million each to social change philanthropy of some kind. This was more than all the 85 women's funds at the time were raising and distributing annually. Together, I had the belief that we could double the dollars and donors who were sparking human generosity, funding feminism, and investing in political leaders, and that with careful shaping that we would at least create an alternative to the patriarchy or leverage a crack in its roots through these well-connected women at the top. These women were not just part of the top 2% of the American population, but at the top 0.5% globally in terms of their income and assets. These women had influence, but did we know how to use it? What I did not anticipate was the lack of exposure and analysis that many women donors had, and how burdened they would become in the growing needs of their local communities and families. Few of them had ever worked or given internationally. We moved them in funder tours internationally on the subject of sex trafficking, on the subject of international media, on trying to get them to understand and see through the conference at Beijing and other global opportunities. They are still moving out and moving forward. The more visible they became, the harder it was for most of them to forge and maintain a giving strategy or their own theory of change. Feminism and its theories and history were not fully understood by this generation. And I was, with Jen, a minority in our more socialist commitment. Each of these women donors as they became public, were besieged by thousands of requests annually, sending most of them into greater reflection and often retreat into an anonymity again. They needed staff, but were, by and large, ill-equipped to manage along with children or enormous responsibilities, and were resistant to their public roles in the face of the demands of their private roles. And yet, they found ways to strategize together and continue to find ways to move their money out. This group is now 100 women and contributed to the last political election over $12 million in an attempt to overthrow the current regime in America. We take no pride in the fact that we were not successful or that the other side managed to manipulate the final figures. Women have always been leaders in the gift economy, and women donors who reject the exchange model of philanthropy, and unfortunately philanthropy has become more of an exchange model as men have gotten more involved. But those who do reject this exchange model of philanthropy are liberated into the simple joy of giving, of purely giving. The question is, shall we keep developing alternative communities and economies? How then shall we influence men and boys and others to make systemic change? And what are the leverage points? Women's shelters began first in the anti-violence movement in the late 70s, programs for perpetrators or for violence prevention, but those men who have truly stepped up to change the conditions of violence in America are few and far between. We honor those of you in the room who are here. Women have always managed to convene and express their passions for justice. In the 19th century, women came forward at the time of the Underground Railroad when the slaves were moving from the south to the north in the U.S. A white woman would place a quilt upside down on her clothesline to signal that food and water would be waiting in the basement for the slaves, those slaves seeking freedom to the north. This in the face of many of their husbands being part of the KKK, no doubt. Women have convened in the public sector and helped each other in partnerships and non-hierarchical formats, from quilting bees in the 19th century to child care cooperatives, driving cooperatives, book groups, sports teams, church ladies, tzedakah circles, caregiving groups, to business and professional groups, investment groups, microloan groups, and then women's foundations. In the 21st century, it is women's giving circles that are emerging as the preferred model of women's collectivity. These giving circles are headed by women, with shared monies going generally to women-serving or women-led community-based organizations. Women give $5, $25, $50, $100, $1,500, or $25,000. It is up to them how much they contribute. There are now hundreds of these in the United States, and there will be thousands of them. We must claim them and shape them as the evolution of feminism and the ways, just like the 12-step programs and the women's spirituality circles, that demonstrate the power and collectivity of collaboration. And we must teach and partner with these women to learn more about how to be effective social change activists. I have been thrilled at the women's giving circles, but wanted too for women to give up control through giving to more community-based foundations. The politically powerful model would be the community-based model in which donors would pool and collectivize their activism with grassroots activists, creating, I thought, better decision-making, not just for donors to only be making the decisions, but for it to be a more community-based process. The more community-based decisions were made by activists at the table, the more we would really understand that which needed to change. This was clear. Either way, women do learn and understand the power of sharing and engagement. The lessons of giving up class-based control may take for many a lifetime. Nonetheless, the gift of the women's funding movement has been a significant move toward the democratization of philanthropy. We knew that the public sector, 70% of women now fill the public sector. There are only 30% of people working in the nonprofit sector are men. We must expect no less of the women in this sector than to create radical and dramatic change. How best to do that? Counterbalancing that which goes on in government and that which goes on, certainly, in business. We must deepen and diversify in order to make that critical change. If someone had told me that my sense of abundance and hope would come from giving all that I inherited and by stepping up to give over 50% of what I earned, I would say, you've got to be kidding. Jen Vaughn's dedication to her philosophy and her setting up of nonprofits and the staff who have given freely to support so many of these projects in the public for free. And she invested over $18 million of her own money, and her ongoing tenacious dedication to shifting the paradigm and presenting a roadmap to do so will always daily be an inspiration to me and others. I know well that mistakes in judgment come with fatigue, as one is hoped to be a visible, if not fully accessible, bridge in this work. I spend half my time working with donors and half my time listening to those who do not have resources to see how I might best connect them. I know, too, that making and being called to make so many decisions involves the exploration and challenges of expressing power. We were trained to lead and to dominate. When I have fallen short of my own potential as a leader, or better yet, as a partner, I have taken spiritual guidance from others who are trying to make similar changes. Jen is one. Our shared difficulties as products of the patriarchy with respect to power and domination is natural. We who did not want to be seen as dominators or matriarchs means we have had to suffer at times by not having the skillfulness or consciousness needed to broadly redistribute power or resources while holding on to our own and others' developing wisdoms. But no one can say that we have not experimented or done everything possible to try to bring justice and feminine values to the table. Jen, I make a deep bow to you for all that you and your band of angels have done. Woo! Woo, 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 woo! Woo! True audacity is in our midst. And I thank each of you for all that I have heard and seen of your legacies and your activism. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not quite done, sorry. The key is now how to make visible the stories and dreams and work that is going on for countless others. This will take a revolution in the media and our use of it. We need more daring and caring women donors to advance all that has been laid. Younger women demand our politicization and speaking up. We have found our voices, but we are still learning to use our passion and our leadership and our voices effectively. A quite amazing infrastructure really has been laid in only 30 years. I'm the first to admit that feminist values have been cloaked or dropped out visibly for making of this past 15 years of this revolution. It was intentional. We've had a choice to expand the movement and then politicize it, or face the limitations of the feminist movement in the mid and late 80s. We chose to expand the movement and are now busy working very hard to politicize it. Perhaps we made the wrong choice, but we are working very hard and need your help to deepen. Given the fears present now and the hesitations of so many, I completely agree that we must bring back front and center a vision of a just society and how best to get there. Many agree that women are the guides to lead us to survival. I also agree that languaging and how we express ourselves and our vision must be inspiring and ignite against the passions and hopes of all citizens. Our time is seemingly, sadly short to save the planet. Yes, the future of humanity does depend on this strategy and how we unfold it. In the end, I do not know if prayer or activism will save the world. I know I am called with you to do both. It is very hard to face that after 30 years of full-time work that the richest 20% have more income, in fact 75 times that of the poorest 20% of the world, up 30 times as much as in 1960, and that half the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. But that is where we are, and we must continue to educate and effect the radical change needed to bring capitalism and the patriarchy to its conscience, if not its knees. Recently in Scotland for a visit to see the physical presence of the divine feminine with Margie Adam, another feminist activist, about the time of the Iraqi prison abuses, I was given a message there, as spirits are keen to do. It was a message of the kind that is the gift economy, not tied up in the complexities of matriarchy or patriarchy, capitalism or socialism. It was simply this: the world speeds up, but you must infuse wisdom, this spirit and hope in the honored practices of indigenous peoples everywhere. Women and caring men must counterbalance and stop the exponential destruction being perpetrated by their exponential and effective good. Step up and step out. Make the dreamers and the dream makers more visible. Make your vision for a just society clear, and get out of the fog. And so my journey for justice continues, and so too yours. Transformation is a gift delivered through faith and feminism and action. We are on path. Let us simply invite and engage the millions who seek our sharing, our sustainable ways, and our affirming bridge building to another way, a joyous, giving way. It is not too late. I see thousands of people of goodwill doing good deeds daily. I've been on the road now for 200 days a year for over 25 years, and I'm perhaps the most hopeful person you shall ever meet. Yes, Las Vegas is a reminder, and so too the devastation of AIDS in rural Africa, but we are here to turn the tide. In the end, Jeanette Armstrong's message is, along with Ishmael's, the key. Giving is the only way to be fully human. Will we be takers or givers? We know the power of giving. 85% of Americans now give philanthropically. 61% volunteer 3.3 hours a week, but they are not making structural change. Our task is not impossible. It is about taking what we have done and becoming more effective spokespeople for the clear changes needed. We shall go forth. We shall inspire others with the tenacity and solidarity of the movement of agrarian women of Argentina. If you have not read the new book that was gifted us, I urge you to run to the end of the book and read this fabulous story. May the spirit of abundance and hope continue to grace us each as we do this powerful realignment work. Let us go forth with confidence in our call and our collective capacities. Let us, above all, partner and share with each other from this day forward with love. Thank you.